I never thought I would become the kind of woman who measured a relationship by the weight of someone else's name. But there I was, standing in a bright kitchen with morning light on the counter, hearing my boyfriend mention the same coworker again and again and again until her name felt less like a fact from his day and more like a pebble dropped in my chest. Small at first, then impossible not to notice. That was what made the whole thing so unnerving. He was not careless, not cold, not shady in the obvious ways people warn you about. He was my best friend before he was my boyfriend. We had lived together through graduate school, turned friendship into love, survived distance, and built our way back to each other. I trusted him so naturally that suspicion felt like wearing somebody else's coat. When he moved states to be with me, it felt like a promise made physical. He packed up a familiar life, came to a city that still felt half strange to both of us, and started over because he believed our future was waiting here. We moved into an apartment with polished hallways and giant windows. And for months I walked around believing we were approaching the easy, glowing part of the story. I was not a jealous woman by nature, which almost made this worse. He had female friends before. He had gone to lunch with women, joked with women, texted women, and I had never felt my stomach tighten over it. I believed men and women could be friends. I still do. That belief was not what cracked. What cracked was the strange speed of this closeness and the way it began filling every corner. He had just started settling into his new job after a stressful stretch of tests and applications. I knew he missed home. I knew he missed the easy shorthand of old friendships, the people who already understood his humor and his habits. So when he first started mentioning a coworker named Liz, I was genuinely relieved. Good, I thought. He found someone at work he clicks with. Every new city needs a first familiar face. At first, she entered our life in harmless little fragments. A funny thing she had said at work. A connection she had to my field. A mutual name from our overlapping professional circles. The city shrank in that cozy way cities do, turning strangers into neighbors through a few shared institutions and coincidences. I even felt charmed by it, that small world glow where everybody seems one handshake away from everyone else. Then her name stopped arriving as a detail and started arriving as a rhythm, breakfast conversation, dinner conversation, a story from the drive home, a comment while brushing teeth, a laugh in the middle of folding laundry. He spoke about her every day, and not dramatically, not defensively, just with the casual frequency of someone whose attention had quietly reorganized itself around a new person. I'd myself beret at Offiank. She apparently wanted to meet me. He seemed happy, lighter somehow, the way lonely people look when they finally start forming roots. I did not want to punish that. I did not want to become the anxious girlfriend who mistakes every female presence for a threat. So I kept swallowing my ennies in neat little pieces and calling it maturity. One evening he mentioned she lived nearby in a temporary place and had suggested they start carpooling. The office was around the corner on our good day decent drive, tin traffic. It stretched into that intimate trapped space where two people can turn commute into confession before either one realizes what is happening. I smiled when he said it, but my mind had already started calculating time alone. I tried to reason with myself. Carpooling saves money. Carpooling is practical. Carpooling is what coworkers do in expensive cities full of brake lights and overpriced gas. I did not say anything. I wanted to be fair. I wanted to be the version of myself who could watch a situation unfold without tugging at it too soon. So I treated my discomfort like a draft under a door and pretended it was coming from somewhere else. A few days later, he casually announced he was heading out to pick her up on the way to work, and the detail landed with a little thud. It was not that he had done something wrong. It was that the plan had become real somewhere offstage, beyond my awareness. And I was only hearing about it at the moment it happened. Nothing was broken. But something had quietly shifted out of my sight. Then the story took a sharper turn. He told me Liz and her fiancé were apartment hunting. Fine. Lots of people apartment hunt. Then he said they were touring our building. Not the neighborhood. Not a building nearby. Ours. The same polished lobby, the same elevators, the same long hallway where I padded around in socks at night. I remember staring at him and feeling my chest go cold in a way I could not explain. Our building was lovely, sure. It had the city view glamour developers sell like a fantasy of adulthood, but there were dozens like it nearby. When he told me they had decided to rent here, my smile came out thin and delayed. I could almost see the future rushing toward us, practical and innocent on the surface, full of shared rides, elevator encounters, texts about packages, favors, casual closeness disguised as convenience. I met her only briefly. In one of those weird transitional moments that feels too small to matter and too awkward to forget. Elevator doors, quick smiles, a polite introduction while management led them around. She seemed normal, pleasant, perfectly unremarkable in the way that should have comforted me and somehow did not. The strange thing about fear is that it does not always need a villain. Sometimes it only needs an opening. After that, I started noticing the invisible architecture of their connection, more texts, a couple of calls. Logistics? Probably. Work? Probably. Apartment stuff? Probably. Every explanation was reasonable. Every explanation was thin. I was not going through his phone. I was not counting minutes. But I could feel how often she crossed his orbit, how naturally she had become part of his daily weather, and I hated not knowing where innocence ended. The moment that really lodged itself inside me happened during a family lunch over a holiday weekend. We were out of town with my relatives, passing plates, making small jokes, performing the soft choreography families always do. He stepped away to take a call in another room. When he came back, he said only that someone had called. Later, when I asked who, he admitted it was Liz with a few questions about the move. That should have been nothing. A phone call is not a betrayal. A question about moving is not a secret affair. Yet what unsettled me was the feeling that if I had not asked, I might never have known. Not because he had lied outright, but because he had started editing in tiny ways, clipping details that might make me react. That kind of omission can make even ordinary moments feel strangely lit from underneath. The next flash of alarm came on the way to the airport. I was staying with family a few extra days, and he was heading back alone. We talked about flights, traffic, luggage, all the usual harmless things. Then I asked, almost randomly, if he was just taking a ride home from the airport. He hesitated for half a beat and said he had been thinking about asking Liz to pick him up instead. Nothing happened. He did not end up asking her. He even agreed that it would be a bad day to bother someone who was in the middle of moving. But by then I felt like I was collecting little shards of a pattern, not evidence of cheating, not proof of anything ugly. Just a cluster of moments where her presence was becoming more central and more lightly concealed, as if he knew it might upset me and hoped not to stir it. That was the hardest part to explain, even to myself. I was not convinced he wanted her. I was not convinced she wanted him. What frightened me was the idea that emotional momentum can exist long before anyone gives it a name. Two people can drift toward intimacy while calling it convenience, friendship, timing, geography. They can cross lines without ever intending to, simply because no one stopped to draw the map before walking. Back in our apartment, I moved through ordinary tasks with a mind full of extraordinary noise. I folded towels too neatly. I let dishes soak too long. I watched city lights blink beyond the glass and imagined future versions of us. Some where I stayed silent and grew resentful, some where I spoke too harshly and became unfair. Some where I waited until a real problem formed, because I was too afraid to name the early shape of one. I kept asking myself the same questions in slightly different clothing. Was carpooling too intimate? Or was that paranoid? Was it wrong for them to text outside work if most of it was practical? Could I ask for boundaries without sounding controlling? Could I say I felt uneasy without accusing him of something he had not actually done? There are moments in relationships where the right sentence feels hidden inside a locked room. For a while I almost convinced myself to wait. Maybe the intensity would fade naturally. Maybe once the move settled, once work got busy, once everybody adjusted, the whole thing would shrink back into proportion. But silence has its own momentum. I could feel my discomfort hardening with every day I said nothing, turning from a manageable feeling into a private mythology. I knew if I waited too long, I would eventually speak from panic instead of honesty. So when I came home from the trip, I asked him if we could talk. My heart was beating like I was about to confess to a crime. He looked worried immediately, which somehow made it harder. I told him I was happy he had made a friend, and I meant it. Then I told him that the frequency of their contact, the rides, the calls, the little surprises, had begun to make me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't ignore. I did not accuse him of cheating. I did not demand he stop seeing her. I just laid the pieces on the table the way they had landed on me, the constant stories, the carpooling, the phone call at lunch, the airport ride idea, the odd feeling that I was discovering parts of the friendship after decisions had already been made. My voice shook in places, but I kept going because truth sometimes needs to limp before it can stand. He listened, really listened. No eye roll, no defensive laugh, no argument built out of technicalities. I watched his face change as he understood that my discomfort was not a performance and not an attack. It was grief over a trust I still had, but suddenly felt responsible for protecting. He told me he had not realized how it looked from my side. He said he never wanted me to feel pushed outside the frame of his life. Then he did something simple that changed the temperature of the whole room. He offered to stop carpooling with her. He offered to cut back on their contact outside of work. Not dramatically, not as if she were some dangerous temptation, but because my comfort mattered to him. The instant he said it, I felt something unclench. Not because I wanted to police him, but because willingness is often the clearest proof that someone is still holding your hand. I surprised myself with my own answer. I told him I did not actually think the rides themselves were the real issue. They made practical sense. Gas was expensive. Traffic was awful. What I needed was not a grand prohibition. What I needed was daylight, context, inclusion. I told him I wished I had met her sooner and that I wanted to meet both her and her fiancé properly, not in some elevator cameo that solved nothing. He agreed right away, and his enthusiasm caught me off guard. There was no reluctance, no stall, no strange hesitation. He set something up for the following weekend, just the four of us, drinks at a place near our building. As soon as the plan was real, I felt an entirely different kind of nervousness. I had spent so much energy worrying about what she represented that I had almost forgotten she was also just a person. The night of the outing, I watched myself in the mirror longer than usual before we left. It was not about impressing anyone. It was about armor, about wanting to walk into uncertainty looking composed. The city outside had that evening sparkle that makes everyone feel slightly cinematic. In the elevator down, I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I kept wondering whether one awkward hour might decide the emotional climate of the next several years. When we met them, nothing exploded. No hidden currents flashed across a table. No inappropriate energy passed between them like a wire. It was awkward for maybe 10 minutes in exactly the ordinary way meeting new people is awkward. Then conversation began to settle. Her fiancé was funny. She was warm. We discovered overlapping professional circles, shared interests, Mutual tastes bits of nerdy enthusiasm that made the whole thing feel less like a threat and more like a chance encounter. I kept waiting for the uncomfortable clue, the look that lingered too long. The private joke I would not be included in, the chemistry that would hum in the room whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Instead, what I found was balance. He looked at me the way he always did. She included me naturally. Her fiancé seemed entirely at ease. The entire structure I had built in my head started losing beams one by one. By the time we left, I felt embarrassed by the heaviness I had been carrying alone. Not because my concerns had been foolish, but because isolation had enlarged them. That is what fear does in secret. It becomes its own interior architect, designing rooms far more ominous than reality. The more I talked with her, the more she became specific instead of symbolic, and specific people are usually less terrifying than the roles we assign them from a distance. After that night, the friendship expanded in a different direction. We all started spending time together. Dinner sometimes, drinks sometimes, weekends here and there. The building that had once felt like a stage for impending trouble became simply a convenient place where friends lived close enough to borrow sugar, share a bottle of wine, or laugh too loudly on a Saturday evening. The whole atmosphere of our life changed with almost suspicious speed. Then something even stranger happened. Liz and I became friends outside of the group. Actual friends, not dutiful acquaintances making the best of a weird circumstance. We texted, we talked about work. We swapped stories and frustrations and tiny domestic details. She came upstairs for dinner. I went to her place. The more I knew her, the more absurd my old fear began to seem, not because fear is stupid, but because it had simply been incomplete. That did not mean my earlier feelings were invalid. Looking back, I still think the intensity and opacity of the early friendship would have unsettled plenty of people. What changed was not the past. What changed was the amount of sunlight on it. Once everyone was visible to everyone else, the uncertainty dissolved. There is a huge difference between closeness that hides in corners and closeness that comfortably invites more chairs to the table. He and Liz still carpooled sometimes, but it no longer felt charged. There were no secret after-hours hangouts, no private orbit growing stronger while I stood outside it. If anything, the energy shifted toward a wholesome kind of group familiarity, shared building life, shared social plans, shared jokes. My body relaxed before my mind fully caught up. I remember one evening realizing I had gone hours, maybe days, without feeling that old clenched question in my chest. Relief can arrive quietly. It does not always kick the door open. Sometimes it just settles over your life, like clean air after a storm you are not sure ever truly landed. I felt lighter in ways I had not anticipated, less watchful, less interpretive, less interested in decoding every detail. What I had really wanted, all along, was not control. It was reassurance that our relationship could hold other people without loosening its grip on us. Then, just when I thought the whole saga had finally found its gentle ending, another thread that had been weaving through the background moved to the center.
$1 each,
Less than a month after I had
150.
first gathered the courage to voice my fears.
Got any late?
He
Yes,
planned a
right
dinner
here.
that felt special enough to notice and ordinary enough not to alarm me. I dressed for a nice evening, thinking romance, not revelation. The restaurant was beautiful in the dim. Flattering way that makes every table look like a memory in progress, candlelight, low conversation. The city beyond the windows glittering like it had secrets of its own. He was attentive, affectionate, slightly more emotional than usual, but not enough to make me suspect the scale of what was coming. If anything, I remember thinking how grateful I felt that we had navigated that difficult conversation and come out steadier. When we got home, he opened the apartment door and I stepped into a scene so dreamlike I nearly stopped breathing. Roses, candles, soft light spilling across every surface. The place we lived in every day had transformed into something theatrical and intimate at once. as if someone had taken all the private hope we had ever spoken aloud and staged it in petals and flame. I turned toward him, already crying without understanding why. He got down on one knee, and in that instant every anxious thought I had carried over the last few weeks seemed to fall away like something old and flimsy. The man in front of me was not drifting away. He had been walking toward me with intention the entire time. "I do not remember every word," he said, "because joy has a way of turning language into weather. But I remember certainty like a bell ringing through me." I said yes before the moment could even fully arrive. Then I cried the kind of helpless, body-shaking tears that make you laugh at yourself while they keep coming anyway. We called family. We called friends. My face hurt from smiling. The apartment glowed around us like a held breath finally released. For hours I existed inside that bright disbelief people always describe after life changes and somehow never quite prepare you for. Then came the detail that rewrote the whole emotional history of the month. Liz had helped him plan the proposal, while I had been quietly interpreting their closeness as a possible threat. She had been helping him build one of the happiest nights of my life. The flowers, the candles, the champagne, the accessories, all of it had passed through her apartment. She had become a secret keeper, not because she was stealing something from me, but because she was helping him give me something. He told me she had stored everything downstairs so I would not see deliveries. She had even held onto the ring in the days before the proposal. Suddenly every unexplained text, every logistics-heavy call, every odd practical reason, they seemed in touch so much snapped into a new shape. There is a peculiar humility in discovering that the mystery you were bracing yourself against was actually a kindness being assembled just out of sight. After he proposed, she came upstairs to take photos. She cried with us, laughing through tears, thrilled in that wholehearted way only generous people can be when somebody else's happiness blooms in front of them. I remember looking at her through my own tears and feeling the last shard of suspicion dissolve. Not because she had proven herself through some test, but because I finally saw the role she had really been playing all along. That night became larger than an engagement story. It became a story about how easily fear can misread incomplete information, and how powerfully honesty can rearrange a situation before it hardens into damage. If I had stayed quiet, I might have kept building a secret resentment around events I did not understand. If he had become defensive, we might have widened the crack instead of sealing it. Instead, we chose the unglamorous miracle of simply talking. In the weeks after, life took on the tender busyness that follows a proposal. Calls, plans, ideas, half-serious wedding talk turning into real decisions. And there she was, not as the woman I had once feared, but as one of the people cheering loudest for us. Sometimes the universe has a wicked sense of irony. Sometimes the person your insecurity paints in dark colors is actually standing there with tape, ribbon, and flowers, helping build your joy. Our friendship with them deepened naturally after that. The four of us slipped into an easy rhythm. We found our favorite places nearby. We spent nights comparing notes about marriage logistics, work chaos, apartment quirks, family expectations. The whole thing that had once felt like an emotional threat turned out to be the doorway to a richer little life than I had expected in this still new city. Sometimes fear points toward loss and accidentally leads you to community. I still think about the version of me standing in the kitchen at the start of this story, listening to the repeated mention of one name and feeling her calm begin to fray. I want to be gentle with her. She was not crazy. She was noticing a change in the emotional weather and trying to decide whether to trust the forecast. The mistake was never the feeling. The danger would have been letting that feeling become a silent ruler. There is a difference between boundaries and walls, and I understand that more clearly now than I did then. A wall says, no one gets close. A boundary says, I need honesty, context, and respective closeness is going to exist safely around us. What saved us was not shutting another person out. It was opening the conversation wider. It was allowing concern to be spoken before it transformed into accusation or control. When people hear stories like this, they often want a villain or a twist sharp enough to justify the tension. But real life is messier and often kinder than that. Sometimes the suspense comes from ordinary uncertainty, from the fact that human beings are terrible at seeing the full shape of something while living inside it. Sometimes the happy ending is not a surprise betrayal uncovered. Sometimes it is the revelation that trust was there, asking to be handled carefully. If I had to name the heart of what happened, I would not call it jealousy. I would call it fear of being quietly displaced. And if I had to name what healed it, I would not call it luck, though luck played its glittering part. I would call it transparency, a talk in the living room, a drink with strangers who became friends, a willingness to let real people replace imagined versions of them before imagination did too much damage. So that is how the story ends, not with betrayal, but with a brighter room than the one we started in. A woman who spoke before her worry poisoned her. A man who listened before defensiveness could turn him stubborn. A new friend who was never the enemy at all. And an apartment once haunted by what-ifs, now glowing with candles, roses, photographs, and the lovely ridiculous truth that love had been planning a surprise downstairs the whole time.